Okay, this is going to be a response to Eric Weinstein vaccines, Ivermectin, and Dark Horse, which was an interview on Rebel Wisdom of Eric Weinstein. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about some of the themes that were being engaged in this interview. I mean, I've not listened to this whole. I've listened to 40 minutes and it's 50 minutes, so I've not heard the last 10 minutes, perhaps when they get into Sam Harris, and I mean I have my own particular gripes with Sam Harris. I call him. I think I've labeled him as essentially a kind of cerebral histrionic, and I've got recordings that deal with that kind of property, which is the people that really need to belong to a narrative. They need to belong to some kind of they reduce things into an oversimplified, sort of conflation or reduction, often so that they can play games with the default position where they get to project the burden of proof on other people. They get to have other people have to surmount sort of hard skepticism because somehow their position is sort of given some kind of prestige in some kind of orthodox merit, or it has some kind of virtue of being the orthodox position. And this I find incredibly intellectually brittle. It's very insufferable in some sense to have to deal with someone who is doing that, because it's a kind of rhetorical sophistry as well. But and it's also kind of like a confidence game, and it's a bit of a confidence grifting. And but Sam Harris, in some sense, I mean, you can see this in his Trump derangement syndrome quite explicitly. I think that he it's a kind of sort of audience capture, although it's a narrative capture, because these people psychologically they need to inhabit a kind of universalism, a kind of ideal narrative that where you can claim this higher ground, where you can claim this orthodox position. And so Sam Harris is always keeping his ear to the ground and making sure that he's sort of on the right side of the mob, as it were. And he doesn't want to lose too much of whatever acclaim that he has been able to accumulate. And I mean, I see this. I mean, this is a theme that is even the reason why I'm talking about this is because this is one of the themes which were entered into at the beginning of this interview, where they were talking about what are the problems on the heterodox side of the fence, what are the problems in the intellectual dark web, if I can frame it like that, even in terms of things like audience capture. And this is a kind of audience capture, but it's much more perhaps subtle and psychological and ubiquitous as well, because cerebral histrionic type behavior, I think, is a kind of developmental obstacle that people fall into. It's a way of not growing up. It's a way of not fully maturing and developing in your own intellectualism. And in some sense, it's a kind of abrogation of good faith as well. This intellectual good faith gets kind of commodified into some kind of power game tokenism within this narrative, where you have to represent some kind of visionary, you have to be the representative of some narrative principle, as in like the representative, an agent of a principle. The agent binds the principle, so you need to be an agent of some grand narrative, or something like that. That's what I mean by orthodoxy as well. So that is one way to have somewhat of a secured or crystallized in psychological schema, a kind of internal system of sort of stabilizing what I would call the false ego complex. But anyway, I don't want to go too much into my own jargon. But and people play this game where they want to be agents of some kind of external locus of control, some kind of external narrative and orthodoxy, because it gives them something to do, because then they have something to work towards in terms of field marshalling people towards this, sort of ideal narrative or something like that. and as to refining the version of that external locus of control and that orthodoxy. It gives them a sense of order and purpose. It's perhaps in terror management theory, this is one way to accomplish a kind of death denial as well. That you can imagine that you're leaving behind a system that will continue to function for 10,000 years or 1,000 years, or have some great lineage that you're part of sort of building up or something like that. But it's a way of also psychologically sort of being a part of the world. I'm not going to get too much into the spiritual aspect of this, but this gives something for people to do in terms of accumulating some kind of prestige and some kind of self-importance as well. Gets secured by this kind of amalgamation of the self-identity, of the perspective, being a proponent, which is an agent of this kind of unconscious orthodoxy or unconscious narrative. That is this kind of grand fatalism or determinism or grand project that is being collectively engaged in. And so the idea is that, well, if you're going to have societies, you're going to have collective entities of many individuals. It's much easier to sort of manage this if there is an idea that you're part of this zeitgeist stream, that you're part of this, the spirit of the times and the spirit of the group and the destiny of the group and the destiny of the narrative. All these things somewhat, if that is the kind of idolatry which is used to cohere people into workable structures and a way to architect a kind of social engineering, you can see why this kind of ideological framework, which I'm also saying is a kind of psychological schema, is a useful sort of template. Because it really gives you a real good sense of grounding within that unconscious matrix of the narrative. You just have to believe that that narrative is held up by itself, that it has some kind of external purchase. This is why Sam Harris's epistemology and philosophy is so egregiously stupid. Why he believes, in sort of the matrix of scientism and mathematics, or some kind of that you can, everything can be derived from some kind of sort of nominal unimatrix that you can use to answer all human questions, including questions of values and ethics, that all can be derived from some kind of thing, like some kind of scientific, sort of set of procedural beliefs and axioms and processes or whatever can all derive these sorts of things. And why in their more esoteric moments will eventually sort of undermine agency and self-determinism, self-ownership and free will itself, that we're all just, sort of unconscious meat machines of this narrative as well. It ends up precipitating that kind of nihilism as well, if you actually try to fully reason it out. And so usually there'll be some kind of utilitarian way in which you fudge this way. Well, don't ask the question, the illusion is good enough, or something like that. Or sort of just cope with what you are and plug yourself into this cloud narrative and do what your instinctual programming seems to suggest that you're there to fulfill, and take your marching orders from the script of the narrative or something like that. And we can be rationally certain about what the script should be in this particular context, so it has its own sort of tools of divination and its own, sort of processes and procedures of deriving, sort of rationalization that ends up being people's marching orders. It is in some sense very much like the Krypton supercomputer of Brainiac in the Superman comic books. You invent an AI intelligence that says you're too stupid to understand the universe and truth and reality. I'll tell you your marching orders. Krypton and Brainiac is really the perfect sort of analogy for this kind of mentality of the cerebral histrionic as well. Anyway. You can almost make parallels, sort of to demonic sort of possession to some degree, or sort of, anyway, or it's perhaps easier just to call it a kind of idolatry, because it will always have to interface with people through some kind of reductionism, some kind of interface in which you can translate your your epistemic agency has to be subjugated to some kind of epistemic reliabilism on some narrative, on some tokenism. Anyway, okay, I'm getting quite esoteric. Let me get back to the point. So my point is that you see people inside, because this kind of cerebral histrionic property is a perennial obstacle that people have to confront, because they have to confront it on the level of the unconscious side of the mind, on the participatory aspect of engaged living, and in which you have to not give yourself over to that kind of, let's say, shortcut, as it were, um, because there's also so much of the world, so many people are, if they're engaged in this mode of this kind of cerebral histrionic, sort of school of thinking, and sort of, where they each have their own little dominion of their particular idolatry, of their particular reductionism that gives them their version of the narrative determinism or fatalism, then at least you've got a bit of a uniform project of which narrative should dominate the other narratives, or perhaps which narratives are better than others, or something like that. So saying that, well, you have to pick some kind of hill to die on, you have to choose some kind of narrative in order to be the aegis, or in order to be the vehicle through which that you're going to navigate through life, because everyone is in to this grift, and therefore it's better to sort of get in on it yourself, just so that you can have some kind of territory yourself. Otherwise, you're just always going to be a kind of atomic individual in the sea of tumult. And you can see these kinds of compromises, and this is why I even sometimes criticize Brett Weinstein, because he doesn't take a principled enough stance against identity politics, which I know might seem egregious, or sort of hyperbolic for me to say that, but how he relents into the statistical reductionism, oh, well, we do have these differences in outcomes, therefore, there is some kind of systemic bias or something like that. That whole frame of reference, believing in the generalization, sort of homogenizing reality into this reductionism, this dehumanizing reductionism, conflating people into a kind of racial essentialism, and then saying, well, there's something essential about that race which is causing this difference of outcome. That's completely unsubstantiated. You can't read things like this from statistics. That's just an utter gainsaying, table-thumped, sort of conjecture, and you have to at least try to falsify it before you, just go along on that kind of grift, on that kind of narrative reductionism. So, I mean, I consider Brett to be, to be guilty of being a bit too lax with his moral thinking in that way. Because that I see as a relegation of certain principled moral thinking, and you have to really watch what you're doing in the realm of morality when you're treating people just like statistics, essentially. Anyway, but I'm trying to link this kind of behavior to when people make certain concessions, or they make certain pragmatic allowances, because they say, well, if I take this stance, it doesn't translate that well to the common person, or something like that. Therefore, I have to make sure that in the context of having all these grand narratives that the society is prone to, the mainstream narratives and the schools of thinking within the mainstream narrative about certain subject matter, about certain topics, that I have to navigate these topics very in a very calculated fashion, that I don't dismiss it, because then if I dismiss it, I'll be basically saying, well, either I have credibility or the mainstream has credibility, and I'm going to create this very harsh binary. So it's better to sort of get into some kind of murky gray area, and to sort of just twist my perspective a bit, or I mean, I think Sam Harris is actually captured by these narratives to some degree. I think that he is, because he is quite overtly a cerebral histrionic. In some sense, a lot of people are cerebral histrionics usually over just some subject matter that has to do with how they see themselves existentially to some degree. As I say, it's very useful for getting over death denial. If you look up the social science theory, terror management theory, but anyway, so themes like that. So usually people, I mean, this is why people have such toxic. Some people have quite toxic views around religion and spirituality, because it is where they hold a kind of fatalism around a kind of which is contended by a kind of cerebral histrionic disposition. Um, but people who I think are more toxic are people that tries to take the same thing and unify it with all of their thinking. At least if it's compartmented, you can have some areas in which you are quite reasonable and are quite coherent in your thinking from real principles, where you have, sort of proper reasoning. Whereas if you have if you try to unify everything, which Sam Harris has explicitly tried to do with his, sort of scientism philosophy, um, and ethics, trying to nest everything into, sort of science, um, you can see that in some sense this is more of a need to be seen as self-righteous or right, correct, within the narrative, which is this external locus of control, which is this kind of absolute objective truth or something like that, or as much as a human being is capable of sort of uh, purveying that, or having purchase over it, or having access to it. Um, Often there are quite sophisticated ways in which, because you do have to fudge it, because it doesn't even conceptually really work out. So you have to kind of play a kind of cognitive dissonance game where you work out where you're hiding, um, sort of the or the linkages, or whatever. There's a tremendous amount of cognitive dissonance with this sort of stuff, which ends up usually meaning that you have to try your hardest to conceive of reality from beyond yourself. Jordan Peterson describes this quite nicely. That you have to have a kind of abstracted, sort of depersonalized, but also a kind of third person perspective view of your view. You have to have a God's eye point of view about what it is that you're doing. You have to see yourself as if you were taking on the perspective of the narrative, looking at yourself within the narrative. All of these things, I mean, science demands this. In some sense, that this is how science operates, is because it creates this modeling system. Uh, I'm not going to repeat the problems that science has. Science has huge philosophical problems. Um, but just to suffice to say that science can never tell us anything about the nature of time, because it assumes things about time in order to have that model of reality. Um, and in as much as that we work out that time is not deterministic, that it's probabilistic, that also puts a huge question mark over all of science, in which case you have to relegate science into a kind of, well, it's useful for practical applications, it's a kind of technical art, uh, but it's not telling you anything about reality or truth, so much as you can try to describe truth and reality uh, uh, beyond the conceptualization or understanding of the notion of time, which I think is going to be quite strange. So I mean, yeah, I think that even philosophically is a much more coherent and rigorous way of understanding science. That science is what you get when you try to understand reality in the sort of in the blind spot of whatever time is. Sort of with a certain assumed projection of determinism. Anyway, uh, I don't want to get into. I mean, it's. which obviously makes it a not very fertile ground for deriving important answers to vital questions. And which is why essentially it gets psychology so egregiously wrong, and you can sort of see neuroscience, but also the history of psychiatry, is various forms of people trying to orchestrate sort of houses of cards. I mean, you really have to get a grip on this stuff theoretically and philosophically before you can start to probably work out what some sort of physical correlates are. You have to sort of overcome this issue of time, which is also where the issue of free will and agency is also probably bound and locked within. Um, anyway, sorry, I don't want to get too much into this tangent, but I mean, this is the fundamental mystery, which has already been thrown out by cerebral histrionics because it's swept under the carpet, because you can just have, well, there's this objective reality outside of our subjective awareness anyway, and we can rely on that objective reality even though, our access to it is questionable because we've got some fudged reductionism, and somehow they get along with that somehow. Um, okay, so back to my point about the heterodox thinkers. So anyway, let me just give an example of what I was talking about. Is that I see Brett Weinstein taking certain stances on Trump, which I think are a bit hyperbolic, and I think he's doing this explicitly because he's trying to walk a tightrope, um, to do with his audience, that he has to sort of, because in some sense, if there's this much shouting from people who are undergoing Trump derangement syndrome, then there must, where there's smoke, there must be some fire. So you have to kind of not make a sophisticated argument and end up saying, well, I'm voting for Trump. You have to say something else. You just have, and you just have to come up with something to say about why. And I mean, I will probably congratulate Coleman Hughes because he actually made an argument, a fully reasoned argument why he's not voting for Trump, and at least he explicitly made that argument. I think it's a rather stupid argument. Um, his argument was basically was that he didn't want to argue with people on the left about Trump anymore. He wanted to tackle identity politics, and that isn't possible with Trump because Trump was deranging people so much. So let's just sort of give in to the wailing and the crying of the infant, and therefore they can then have the calmness of mind to grow up and to mature. Um, I think that that's a bad argument. Um, and giving into this kind of sort of psychopathic blackmailing and this hysterical moral panic, which is based on sort of false reporting, is really just giving power to the mainstream media, giving power to the false narratives. Or let me even use Trump's phrase, giving power to fake news, creating narratives. But this it's interesting because I mean narrative is something that I'm even talking about here. This is the problem. Cerebral histrionics run off narratives. You just need a narrative of some objective truth that then people can be right or wrong about factually endorsing or not endorsing. And what makes this more explicitly toxic is when they don't even try to substantiate their narrative anymore by reasoning and by counter argument, but they actually just kind of signal the sentiments, the feelings, the attitudes, the emotions, they which they sort of inculcate in the news audience. That becomes they tell people how to feel about something rather than actually establishing the fact and letting the audience make up their own mind about what to think about it. They are spoon feeding the moral judgment that the audience should be having. What makes the heterodox community slightly better is that they should be showing their workings out, that they should be producing the thinking from first principles, and therefore, sort of saying, well, if I'm wrong about this, it's not that I was wrong. It's that either some of the factual inputs were wrong, or some of the principles that I used were a bit sloppy, and therefore you can even reverse engineer why you got a question wrong, um, and then you can improve essentially, and that, let's say, is real intellectualism. Um, Sam Harris, I think, has always been bad at doing this. I was one of the people who anticipated that in his debate with Jordan Peterson, it would be an abortion, that the whole thing would go so badly. Brett Weinstein managed to, what's the word, uh, to intermediate the Jordan Peterson Sam Harrison debate probably much better than I would have thought possible. Um, because to break Sam Harris out of his layers of narrative, sort of insulation and disguise and defensiveness in his cerebral histrionic, sort of dependency, um, is quite a skillful thing, and Brett managed to do it, and it was more than I would have thought possible. But what the thing that isn't being critiqued of Sam Harris is the fundamental tendency at the base of all of this, which still drives him towards always creating these house of cards and these narratives and these sort of grand, um, yeah. So I mean, this is what I see is the problem in the heterodox community, is that if people, and really, this is also my general response to some of the practical concerns that Eric has. I mean, the real solution to generating real leadership is, first you have to have clean institutions. You have to, and the first institution that should be developed is an academy. You need to have a university that is committed to having things based on principles and values, and that cuts out identity politics, that cuts out all this bullshit, that it can be a voice of reason and can actually be thought leaders and be a kind of collaborative intellectual enterprise that can actually create a model of an alternative response to certain things, and give a model of an alternative, sort of review of situations from the mainstream. And in some sense, if this dilemma between stoicism or fuck you money, well, how about on some level you actually, in some sense, my ultimate response to this is develop enough actual material independence. Try to, I mean, this is perhaps a bit too radical to some people, but this is my argument against the game B, game A, type people of trying to transition between game A and game B. No, that's like sort of the idea that, well, communism only works if you sort of have a worldwide revolution simultaneously. No, no, no. What you have to do is, almost in the same tone that Eric was speaking at the beginning of this particular interview, is that you have to be very pragmatic about the constraints. And when you are dealing pragmatically with the constraints, that is actually the solution. It's not some utopian abstract narrative. It's actually having functional independence. I mean, if you have your own farm and you have your own water supply and you have your own workshop that is tooled enough to have a kind of broad enough industrial base, that you have your own capacity, that you have functional independence on the level of some kind of perhaps decentralized sort of system of society that actually is working on a different level of leadership and principle, and how it's organizing its own sort of concentration of capital investment, because that's how you produce wealth, is that you increase your capital investment and then you get more productivity for less input, and that's how you become a Star Trek civilization. You just start doing that, and maybe you have some trading with the outside world because you're not going to be able to do everything from the beginning, that you sell something that you can produce to the market and you buy things that you can't produce from the market, and you try to manage this until you have enough capacity inside your society. And again, you've created an independent model in which then all the people in your society, which are still, let's say, socially connected with the outside world, that this is like a clubhouse, this is a freedom of association, this kind of cooperative or something like that. But it's not trying to create its own different nation, but perhaps it is trying to create its own, let's say, independent justice system, but done on the basis of contract, not done on so it would be a kind of arbitration system. It doesn't try to displace the actual courts and things like that. And as long as you live in a liberal democratic society, you should be able to operate such a system. And then you actually have the functional independence to actually say the things that you want to say about society, because you have no vested interests, you have no you have no anchorage that you have to worry about. You can actually be a good faith actor, and everyone can know that you're a good faith actor because you're not standing within the system, you're standing outside of it. uh, and in some sense you probably wouldn't want to radically alter the system. You would want to because you wouldn't want it to destabilize and evaporate. You would want it to stabilize itself. You would want a healthy neighbor as well. So politically, in some sense, you would have the right incentives. But anyway, somewhat digressing into this sort of thing. But and then you would also practically confront the real challenges of actually trying to create a different sort of civilization or society. Anyway, and this is another one of my tangents that I always bring up. Sort of, there's not in a liberal democratic society, there's nothing stopping you from orchestrating your own private revolution. Buy your freedom from the market, set it up responsibly, and actually run it better than the system runs itself, and run it in a model that's capable of concentrating capital investment so it accumulates wealth, and so you become like Star Trek. There's nothing stopping people from doing that, except the idea that the narrative should facilitate and do it for them and should bestow upon them some special status rather than actually being engaged in doing it and actually working out what the real practical challenges are. Um, anyway, so I do think that is perhaps the alternative to having to try to get fuck you money, or trying to do stoicism, is that is my third way, although it is a kind of combination of stoicism that graduates into a kind of fuck you money, because once you have an independent resource base, as it were, or you have an independent functionality where all your amenities are catered to, then you basically have fuck. That is, in some sense, the true essence of fuck you money, a kind of functional independence. Okay, anyway, not cultural independence from the larger society, but material independence. Yeah, we're doing a different economic system. We're trying to create an alternative economic arrangement, but it's happens to exist within the capitalistic framework. We just, within our own club, within our own freedom of association, we have our own way of operating. We've developed our own system, our own game of how people command the utilization of resources, and how we collectively plan the expansion and the building up of capacity of getting better amenities or something like that. Anyway, obviously you would want to have some kind of individualism and free choice and maximizing agency and blah blah blah. Yeah, again, a tangent, but that I think is the real way of modeling responsibility. But even on beyond that level, you don't have to go that full route. You could just have an independent academy that has been developed with the right principles, I mean, and values, that creates a kind of thought leadership for that could be a model for society, that could be a good source of criticism for pointing to the policy that is driving certain problems and things like that. Um, that could perhaps also model a certain kind of anti-fragility as well. Um, and I mean, in some sense, I think that what needs to happen as well is to have just departments that aren't being corroded by sort of the diversity and inclusion sort of propaganda, indoctrination, sort of proto-fascist ideology, uh, this kind of group relativism, uh, and this kind of automatic sympathy that you have with a racial identity and a kind of toxic racial consciousness. If we don't start demarcating institutions and saying you're not welcome in these institutions because you don't have the same principles as us, you don't believe in non-racialism, and we don't care that you call yourself an anti-racist, like we actually, you know, we find you morally repugnant. If you don't have that kind of structure, um, I mean, you're not, if you don't treat your values at some point as sacrosanct and important, then you have already, let's say, modeled the surrender of your civilization, of your society, of your, into something else. And on some level, Sam Harris is one of these people. It's just that his narrative doesn't work on the level of racial consciousness. His narrative works on the level of science, and that's it's an uncomfortable thing for me to say, but quite frankly, it because his way of orientating his psychological schema is, in my view, just as small-minded. It's just more esoteric, and so it's harder to um, fathom. It's harder to bring into clear view um, the kind of denigration that Sam Harris's sort of worldview is hinged on, um, the kind of reductionism. Is quite a broad and dilute kind of denigration, which is just basically, well, our free will is just some kind of illusion, but don't think about it because it's not worth thinking about, and then and then we'll just follow our marching orders from the narrative. Anyway, this is why Sam Harris is a toxic intellectual and why it's not really worth engaging with him. It's really a waste of time. Um, and why I think a lot of people, sadly, I think most people degrade themselves because of the company that they keep, because of this kind of association, because they don't separate themselves from this kind of cerebral histrionic bullshit, and so they end up entertaining various degrees of compromise and playing politics, as it were, with not even a view in. I mean, I can understand diplomacy and playing politics to some degree in order to actually reach a point of not having to play politics anymore, or trying to work out some kind of system where everyone knows the rules and they know what the game is and they know what the how the culture is run, and so there's some kind of transparency, there's some kind of, it's not this opaque and murky sort of structure. Now, I would argue that these are the themes that are plaguing the heterodox community. They're quite esoteric, um, and it really has to do with how, let's say, authentically orientated there is a real volitional impetus towards clean governance or clean management or clean administration and genuine intellectual good faith. Like what is the real commitment to that? And on some level, there are going to be casualties in waving that banner, and some of those casualties are disassociation with people like Sam Harris, or at least being able to put him to terms. But perhaps this level of criticism has not yet been developed. Um, it is somewhat psychological, perhaps. It's somewhat nuanced and sophisticated. But and this really, I think, quite quickly brings you down to sort of what's real or whatever. And I mean, yes, I understand that my idea of having an independent system of a different sort of material functionality, an independent material functionality wherein one can be materially separate from society, that might be a bit of a pipe dream. But trying to create an academic institution, it's perhaps also a tall thing to say. Well, there should just be an independent academic institution set up in this way. Um, because I don't, where are the rich people? Why hasn't someone tried to do something like this? The only person that I know who might have some of the money to do this, or and the will, would be someone like Peter Thiel. Um, I don't really know how much money it takes to set up a university. Anyway, but culturally as well. There are ways in which people could set up, let's say, associations or brands that have a particular sort of constitution, and or a particular kind of declaration. And what you would do is you would sort of rate institutions and give them pass marks or failure. And so there would be essentially ways of, because heterodox. The Heterodox Academy had this idea, um, with Jonathan Haidt, tried to create, sort of, and I don't think that we should be mixing with the identitarians. I don't think heterodoxy is that, oh, we will come and we will entertain you. No, we have to actually cut them out as being intellectually toxic, but also fundamentally corrosive. They play these dirty games where they are essentially using the intolerance paradox as a way to as a Mott and Bailey sort of strategy. And if we don't start developing enough institutional integrity that can be resilient to actually confronting the intolerance paradox and working out how to um, create a system of principles and values that is strong enough and iterated well enough that it can withstand, the kind of the caustic reductionism that is being infiltrating, the kind of the cultural zeitgeist, you know, because that is, I've argued that even Brett Weinstein is himself not properly inoculated. He can smell the problem, but he can't. In my view, he doesn't take a principled stand against it. He doesn't. He would not be able to create a system on paper that would be able to be resilient to such a thing. Because if you try to reduce it into a kind of test that isn't properly substantiated, they will just change the frame of their argument slightly. They will just change their semantics. Sam Harris does this. This is why I think it's somewhat useless to try to argue with him, because he will just change the fudging. He will just change the rationalization slightly. Um, this is also, I have the same argument against other sort of people. Rationality rules, so called, and destiny as well, or sort of other sort of cerebral histrionic ideologues. Anyway, I think that was somewhat, perhaps, hopefully that was somewhat useful. But